My husband stared straight at me, no hesitation, no flicker of guilt, and said, "If you've got an issue with me spending weekends with Liana, that's your problem. And if you can't deal with it, you can get lost." There was no dramatic pause. No remorse. Just raw arrogance dripping off every word. But the strangest part? I didn't react the way he expected. I didn't blow up. I didn't crumble. I didn't beg or bargain or demand explanations. It was like someone had turned a switch inside me. And everything that used to hurt suddenly felt far away. Like it belonged to a different version of me. Without saying a word. I walked into our bedroom, opened the closet, and pulled out the suitcase I hadn't used in years. The one I always kept just in case, even though I'd convinced myself I never needed. And then I did the one thing he never believed I had the courage to do. I accepted the international transfer offer I'd been declining for 2 straight years. A move to Orion Tech's headquarters in Singapore. A position I had earned, had been chosen for, but had repeatedly pushed aside so he could feel stable. While I made myself smaller and smaller to fit the version of a wife he wanted, there was no speech. No announcement. No argument. I just left. 2 days later, while I was already halfway across the world. Jet-lagged and surrounded by a skyline brighter than anything he'd ever noticed about me. My phone buzzed. He texted, "Hey, what's your weekend look like?" As if nothing had happened. As if I hadn't walked out of our life like a ghost slipping out of the frame. So I took a selfie, messy hair, city lights blazing behind me, and sent it without a single caption. Because that moment wasn't about showing him where I was. It was about him realizing what he'd lost. And realizing it far, far too late. My name is Mara Winslet. And that was the day I stopped folding myself into the tiny corners of a man who didn't know what loyalty meant. Or what it felt like to lose someone who did. But this story didn't start in Singapore. It started months before in a house that used to feel like mine. Until every room began echoing with a silence that made my bones ache. It was 2 in the morning. And I was in my home workspace, which was basically my personal command center. Monitors humming, soft blue LED lights sliding across the walls, security feeds flickering in the corner. It was the one place in our house where I still felt like myself. I wasn't even looking for anything. Honestly, I'd stopped wanting to know. But the motion alert popped up anyway. Front door. 2:14 a.m. unscheduled entry. The second I saw the clip, I already knew what I'd find. He stumbled inside, half laughing, into his phone. Jacket hanging off one shoulder like he'd been wrapped around someone he shouldn't have been near. And then came the perfume, not mine, not familiar, not subtle. It arrived in the air before he did. Floral, expensive, deliberate. His steps were sloppy, carefree. While mine had become careful over the past few months, not because I feared him, but because I recognized the quiet dread that shows up when you're living with someone who's drifting away but pretending they aren't. He walked toward the kitchen, saw the glow from my monitors, and didn't even try to hide anything. He didn't sober up. He didn't offer an excuse. Instead, he delivered the line that finally cracked the stage beneath us. "I'm staying with Liana this weekend. If you can't deal, get lost." No hesitation. No guilt. No awareness of the damage he'd just caused. Or maybe he knew, and that was the point. I didn't ask who Liana was. I already knew. She was the ex he'd claimed he was completely over. The one he only ever mentioned in a tone just a little too nostalgic. He waited for a reaction. But the truth is, heartbreak doesn't always arrive like a shattered glass. Sometimes it's quiet. A slow unraveling that finally reaches the last thread. My face remained still. But inside, something aligned. When did he stop valuing me? And when did I stop expecting him to? He walked upstairs, still laughing with whoever was on the other end of the call. As soon as he was out of sight, my email pinned. An automated reminder. Your international appointment with Orion Tech. Singapore is still eligible for acceptance. The same offer I had rejected twice because he insisted moving overseas would disrupt the life he worked hard for. Translation: his life mattered more. Mine wasn't supposed to change. This time I didn't delete the message. I didn't overthink it. I didn't weigh the pros and cons. I just felt the shift, the one that tells you something has already ended. You're just catching up. The house felt quiet again. But instead of feeling hollow, it felt clean, clear, like a space I was finally done haunting. I closed my laptop and made my choice. The next morning, I went downstairs to the basement where the heart of my home security system lived. It wasn't just a hobby. It was the ecosystem I designed, coded, monitored, perfected. It was the one part of my life untouched by compromise. I activated an archival pull, the deepest level of system forensics, scraping months of camera logs, audio captures, device metadata, and behavioral analytics into clean, time-stamped packets. I wasn't gathering evidence for revenge. I was gathering truth for closure. When the audio logs finished compiling, I pressed play. His voice filled the room, laughing with friends. The kind of laugh men use when they think their wives aren't listening. Mara's brilliant, I guess, but she's robotic. I need someone who makes life feel exciting. Robotic, not emotional enough. Not soft enough. Not accommodating enough. The labels men love to use when they want their wife to stay loyal but want another woman to make them feel desired. Next came the messages. Threads between him and Liana. She's too practical, Liana wrote. You deserve someone who understands your heart. He replied, Mara won't notice anything. Not because he was sneaky, but because he believed I was too predictable, too loyal, too blindly supportive to even imagine he'd betray me. Then came the clip that changed everything. Even though I didn't react the way you might think, a camera feed from 6 weeks earlier. Him, her, walking into our living room, laughing, touching, glancing around like they thought the security system was just for show. They didn't think I'd actually see it. They underestimated the woman who built the system. I stared at them on the screen, but there was no explosion inside me. No rage, no heartbreak. Just confirmation. Pain doesn't always scream. Sometimes it nods quietly and steps aside so truth can take its place. Later that day, I met an old work partner, Riven, at a small warehouse-style cafe near the tech district. A man who knew me better than anyone outside my marriage. He took one look at my face and leaned back like he already knew the answer to a question he hadn't asked. So, he said softly, this is the last straw. I didn't confirm it. I didn't need to. The silence did it for me. We talked briefly, not about revenge, not about heartbreak, not about confrontation. Just transition. I didn't tell him I had already accepted the transfer. I didn't tell him that by the next sunrise, I would no longer be living in the same country as the man who treated me like a placeholder in his own life. But before the day ended, another audio file surfaced in my system archive, one I had missed earlier. His voice again. This time quieter, more calculating. If Mara and I split, everyone will get it. She's obsessed with work. I tried, but I had to find someone who cared about me. It wasn't the cheating that broke the last remaining piece inside me. It was his script. He had rehearsed the victim role. He wanted the world to pity him. He wanted my success to be the villain of his story. I realized then that leaving wasn't betrayal, staying was. Staying meant helping him maintain the lie. The next morning, I walked into Orion Tech's Denver office like it was any other day. But inside, something had already shifted into a place I didn't know existed, something steady. Cold, grounded. Midway through a system briefing, my phone buzzed. The International Placement Office. Your directorship is still open, they said. If you want it. A position that could reshape my entire career. A life I had dreamed of long before marriage. A dream I put aside because he said ambition created distance. I stepped outside for air. And the moment I unlocked my phone, a story from his page flashed across my feed. He was at an upscale mountain retreat. With her, laughing beside a fire pit like a man reborn, someone off camera asked, what if Mara leaves for Singapore? He shrugged, smiled. If she goes, great. I'll finally have space to live honestly. I didn't feel anger. I felt release. He didn't fear losing me. He expected me to walk away so he could look like the noble survivor of a cold marriage. So I opened the email. Read every line. And this time, I accepted. The real twist? My report date was in 48 hours. No delays. No excuses. The universe wasn't nudging me. It was dragging me toward the life I'd been too afraid to claim. Asterisk, the taxi to the airport smelled faintly of pine and cheap air freshener. I remember the weird smallness of that smell, how oddly domestic it seemed compared to the motion of my life at that moment. I had one suitcase, a carry-on, and a heart that had only recently learned how to stop skipping at security. An overweight traveler jostled my shoulder and muttered an apology. It felt like a private ritual. Tiny collisions, tiny kindnesses, a world moving on while I stepped onto a different track. I turned my phone off for the flight. Not because I wanted to be unreachable, but because I needed to be present in the part of my life that was mine alone. On the plane, I slept in fits and starts. Dreams spun in technicolor, office lights, a kitchen, a face I used to think was the center of everything. Sometimes I woke and stared at the window until the world outside became a smear. Then a map, then a place I could choose to go. By the time we touched down in Singapore, the sky was pink with dawn. The air hit me like a soft hand, humid, warm, fragrant with the tang of coffee and something green and tropical. I remember thinking sharply that for the first time in a very long while, none of the scents around me were layered with someone else's perfume. Helion Tech had arranged a corporate apartment for me, efficient, minimal, and deliberately neutral. Floor-to-ceiling windows that opened onto a harbor where freighters and pleasure boats threaded their slow arguments. I unpacked one sweater, one blue dress, one pair of shoes. Everything else I left folded in the silence, like a previous life I could touch, if I wanted but no longer needed to inhabit. Work filled the days in a way I'd forgotten was possible. Meetings, briefings, the quick bright world of engineers who spoke in logic and recognized my kind of stubborn. People asked questions, not to test me, but because they wanted an answer only I could give. I found myself answering, and the rhythm of that made something inside me unclench. 2 days after I arrived, someone in the office flagged an anomaly, repeated access attempts to an archived account using an old password. The source IP traced back to Colorado. My chest tightened in a way that tray tables couldn't explain. It was Carter. Or someone using him as a key. I changed credentials, notified security, and let their protocols do the rest. But the fact of the attempt felt like a hand on a door I'd closed. Then the messages began, friends reaching out, concerned or curious. A link to an Aspen livestream that showed Carter and Liana leaning into the camera and laughing, the kind of intimacy that broadcasts itself like a promise. Comments under the video ranged from sneering to sympathetic. Someone posted a clip captured at a retreat, Carter saying offhand, "She's always been more machine than wife." You can't build a life with someone who sleeps with her laptop. The clip got 50,000 views in 24 hours. He was retelling our history as if I'd been the antagonist all along. He was the kind of man who would rather have the world believe a tidy lie than see the messy truth. My colleagues tried to shield me. They offered lunch, sent messages of support, suggested PR measures I politely refused. This was not a war won by issuing statements. This was a war of endurance, the slow, steady kind that happens when you stop defending someone else's story and let the facts line up on their own. And the facts did their work. Helion Tech's legal team reached out. Carter had used joint assets for things that legally required disclosure. His employer launched an internal audit after he joked about a client during a live stream. Recordings surfaced of him speaking of me the way men speak of women when they want to make themselves look better. The firm put him on leave pending investigation. Friends of his who used to pester me about being too focused began asking other questions. The narrative cracked. Meanwhile, a message arrived from an unknown Singapore number. "You need to be careful. Carter isn't the only one watching." The sentence exploded differently from everything else. Not because it threatened me physically, at least not explicitly, but because it implied layers beneath his actions. Someone else wanted a story with me in a corner and their hands in the narration. Someone else had been following details I assumed were private. I forwarded the message to Helion Tech Security Ops. They ran a trace and within an hour handed me a list of IP addresses and transactional metadata. One of the IPs traced back to an unsecured network at a boutique property management firm Carter had mentioned once in a casual complaint. He'd laughed about how he liked their mid-century furnishings. It felt like the world was handing me breadcrumbs. I reached out to Riven. He was quiet for a moment over the line, a sound that could have been concern but wasn't, not really. "You want me to look into this?" he asked. "Yes." We found Threads, a vendor on his company's payroll, who'd been contracted for client entertainment. Receipts showed expensive dinners and rooms booked under names that matched the dates Carter had been absent. There were phone logs, travel itineraries tied to gift accounts. Nothing singularly damning on its own, but weave them together and they became a fabric. We started sending questions. Not public accusations, we didn't need to ignite a circus. Evidence would do the toppling. I supplied logs from my home system, timestamps, corroborating clips. Riven fed the data into a vulnerability scanner and privacy audit. Helion Tech's legal brought subpoenas. In the background, Carter continued to post. His narrative matured into a steady refrain. I was losing my wife to her ambition. I tried to be patient, but I needed to find someone who made me feel alive. The pattern was familiar. He always had a way of spinning remorse into righteousness, and yet, the more he tried to sound noble, the less believable he became. Little by little, the world outside our marriage stopped assuming I'd disappeared. They began to see the scaffold he'd erected to make his absence look like an injury. People he once dragged into his script began to recoil. Milo, the woman he'd left me for, reached out in an email later. Her voice was raw. She told me she'd overheard a voicemail where Carter admitted he'd exaggerated elements of his storyline to look sympathetic. He said if he could get people thinking you were unreachable, he'd be free to have something that felt like excitement, she wrote. I thought he meant us. I didn't know he meant to invent the martyr. Her note felt like a confession and a handing over. I didn't respond with venom. I wrote back a short, simple line, take care. And then, because this was how things sometimes resolve when you stop keeping score, she told me she wanted out. She needed distance from someone who treated loyalty like a curiosity. That should have been the end of his story. But we were still in the middle of a chapter that refused to finish. A week later, Carter arrived in Singapore. He cornered me in the lobby of a conference hotel before a panel I was scheduled to speak on. His hair was messy, his voice paper-thin with panic. He begged. He pleaded. He tried to be charming and pathetic in the same breath. You don't have to do this, he said. We can fix it. We can get counseling. I didn't mean I listened the way one listens to a child explaining that the world will be okay if only someone else agrees to do the holding. When he mentioned Liana, he used the old soft inflection he'd always leaned on when he wanted me to soften. She's complicated, he said. You don't understand. I said, I did understand. I just stopped making myself smaller to make your life more comfortable. He looked like someone punched a hole in his script. For a second, I saw the man I had married, the one who loved me in the beginning with a clumsy ferocity, the one who told me I was brilliant and then slowly diluted that praise into insults. But then the old reflex took over. He resorted to the familiar performance, blame, confusion, a demand to be rescued from the consequences of his own behavior. You were my wife, he said, as if naming the role summoned ownership. I thought you'd be there. I didn't think you'd leave for good. I left because every day you made me mean less, I replied. And because I realized you were teaching other people how to treat me. You don't get to decide when I'll exist. He begged for a conversation. I gave him 1 minute. I spoke slowly, deliberately. I left because you assumed I'd always return. I'm not a place you can come back to when convenient. I'm a person you built a life around. You stopped tending to the person. You started assuming silence equaled love. That was the mistake. People deserve to be wanted for who they are, not as props for someone else's story. He tried to turn it around, to call me cold, to call me selfish. The lobby hummed with strangers who would later remember me as a woman who walked away and never came back. I felt their curiosity like small pinpricks. It didn't matter. That night, something else happened I hadn't expected. I received a call from Carter's sister, Rowan. She sounded like someone unaccustomed to making decisions without being overridden by a stronger voice. He's saying you abandoned him, she said. People are calling. He says he can't breathe. I listened to the old cues of a family trying to be loyal, not to me, but to the version of their son they had grown comfortable with. I told her calmly that I wouldn't be coming back to rewrite their narrative. I refused to hold their guilt for them. You could help me, she whispered. Just tell people what happened. I thought about it. I could have launched an all-out campaign, press conferences, interviews, the kind of narrative warfare that rips privacy to shreds. But I wasn't interested in spectacle. I wanted the world to see what it would see if I simply existed without. Explaining myself. Then the unknown watcher thread resurfaced. A message arrived at dawn. Someone from outside his circle has been trying to destabilize you. They're using leaks, attempts to access your devices, and rumors to make you look unstable. Watch your communications. I felt that particular prickle of danger, not because I believed I was in immediate physical danger, but because someone wanted me malleable. If you can make someone feel watched, you can influence how they live. You can make them small again. I asked security to dig deeper. They found a cluster of accounts tied to a freelance reputation management group that specialized in discreet work for high net worth clients. Transaction records showed payment from an account connected to a shell company linked in a tangle of wires to Carter's wider network. There was no single smoking gun, but pattern matters. Pattern is what builds cases. It turned out Carter had not only been building a life away from me, he'd been constructing a safety net to catch him when the truth tumbled out. He'd hire people to seed stories, to leak edited audio, to fake context in a way that would make me seem brittle. He wanted a narrative where my ambition equaled emotional deficit, where the world would be primed to side with him. We responded in a way that felt exactly like the person I wanted to become, quietly, efficiently through channels that favored facts over noise. Helion Tech launched an internal audit related to the livestream. Legal issued cease and desist orders to domains hosting altered clips. We traced at least 3 accounts back to a handful of operators who had lied on contractor paperwork. One by one, their clients dropped them when they realized their work involved fabricating personal stories, a line even some disreputable firms refused to cross. He tried to escalate. He tried to petition HR to force me into mediation as if leaving a marriage meant abandoning all my rights. His requests were denied. Evidence moves slowly, but it has weight. And weight breaks the flimsy. There were smaller battles, too. A mutual friend of ours texted and asked if we could talk in private. There was a tone in her messages that suggested something had tilted in the public eye and people were panicking. People are split, she said. Some are saying you were always cold. Others are saying he's performative. I don't know what to believe. Believe the things you can confirm, I replied. Believe what you see, not what you're told. When you step out of a life, the hardest part isn't leaving. It's letting people go who aren't made to stay. It's watching the ripples of your exit bruise people who were never yours to keep. Weeks folded into months. The world, which had inexplicably been centered on him for so long, began widening its lens. Press mentions began to follow the threads of truth, not the spun versions he had fed them. Legal inquiries showed a pattern of him using client information to ingratiate himself at industry events. The firm he worked for suspended him. Clients quietly moved their business when they discovered the boundaries he'd smashed. And then one afternoon, in a small conference room overlooking a harbor I was starting to feel at home with, I signed divorce papers. No theatrics. No screaming. No confrontations. Just signatures and the soft, almost reverent sound of closure. He sent a message after that, something that read like a benediction and a sentence all at once. You were never mine to keep. I didn't respond. The truth had a simpler gravity than anything he could draft. Even so, the unknown watcher kept poking the edges of my life. The attempts to access accounts slowed, but didn't stop. A package arrived at my office, no return address, a USB drive with nothing but a scrambled file. It smelled of something metallic. I handed it to Helion Tech's ops team. They found traces of a broader campaign to harvest data from people associated with the company's international projects. The script was familiar: social engineering, a mix of public rumor and private access attempts. Someone had been trying to turn the temporal distance of my move into leverage. We tracked one route back to a small firm that sold personal data to entertainment companies and less scrupulous clients. A name popped up in the payment records, an associate of a man who had once done favors for Carter at industry events. The web of favors began to unspool. At a certain point, I realized the watcher wasn't interested in me for my own sake. They were interested in the effect I had on him. They liked the idea that my presence could be used to control him. That, more than anything else, revealed their motive. We closed the holes. We filed complaints. We tightened protocols. We switched phones. We moved meetings. All of it felt like putting locks on the doors of a house I'd never want to live in again. And yet, despite every precaution, small things still leaked into my life. People who once laughed at my jokes changed their tone. He'd built habits of influence that still had echoes. It's surprising how long shadows stick around after the source has left. Then, one rainy evening as I returned from a long day of panels, I found a note slipped under my apartment door. No return address. Just 4 words, you did the right thing. It was a small thing. A human thing. The kind of anonymous kindness you can't catalog or subpoena. It felt like sunlight leaking into a room I half expected to stay dim. That night, I stopped double-checking my locks. Not because I let down my guard, but because there are levels of vigilance that make you forget how to trust yourself. I wanted to remember that for every person who would try to manipulate a narrative, someone else would stand quietly on the side of truth. The legal closure completed, the professional accolades arrived. Helion Tech promoted me to a position with real influence, a role that meant I could set policy in places that mattered. People listened to me now because my voice had consequences that stretched beyond my household. The irony of it all was sharp. The man who wanted my life in order because he was afraid of the unknown had created a chaos no apology could repair. He had been the one who chose to make the truth messy in order to protect a lie. I only had the courage to step away. Months later, in a small panel discussion on cybersecurity ethics, I spoke about the invisible costs of reputational manipulation. People asked questions. Journalists followed up. Carter's name appeared in bylanes tied to investigations into the misuse of client information. He found himself under scrutiny he had never anticipated. He called twice in the beginning, thrice, then less often. Once he emailed a long apology, stitched with the kind of grammar that sounded rehearsed. "I was overwhelmed," he wrote. "I'm sorry. I miss you." I didn't respond. There's a strange power in silence when the other person expects you to beg. 2 years later, during a quiet rain in late spring, I ran into Liana at a charity event. She smiled like someone who had been on a long, difficult pilgrimage back to herself. "I'm sorry about how it ended," she said. "I didn't know. I only knew what he told me." We stood under the warm light of a hallway that smelled faintly of citrus. She reached out and touched my arm with a human tenderness I hadn't expected. "I left him," she said. "For my reasons. Not because of you." Sometimes closure doesn't arrive as fireworks. Sometimes it arrives as 2 women, both better and more truthful, acknowledging the human wreckage left in a man's wake and deciding to stop being part of it. I told her I hoped she found the parts of herself he'd made invisible. She nodded. We didn't have to be enemies. We didn't have to be allies either. We were just 2 survivors who learned how not to apologize for existing. The final chapter wasn't a revenge fantasy. It was an everyday reclaiming, winning a project that would protect millions of user records. Mentoring engineers who needed a voice at the table. Taking a holiday in a country I'd never been to because I wanted to. It was quite things that added up to an ocean. The Watcher faded. Carter's company folded under sanctions and bad press. He moved cities twice, then a 3rd time, each move a smaller echo of who he was. His social profiles grew thinner. The friends who had rallied around his stories drifted away when the evidence coalesced. I heard he started dating again. That's his story to live. I built a new life, step by step, not a life in opposition to his, but a life in full color that had nothing to do with being his complement. I learned to have dinner alone without feeling conspicuous. I learned to laugh loudly and think loudly, to write code that mattered, to leave the office on time because work wasn't the only orbit I wanted to inhabit. I wrote a paper on ethical cybersecurity governance that a peer group used in forming a new set of standards. People I never met emailed to say my work changed the way they protected user data. Those messages felt like small private medals. And somewhere along the way, I realized the most radical thing I had ever done wasn't leaving him. It was choosing to be less afraid of the empty spaces in my life. Not all stories close tidy. Some resolve quietly like a drawer sliding shut. Some thrum with ongoing effort. Mine didn't end with fireworks or a cinematic showdown. It ended with a clarity that had weight. I'm not a plot point. I'm a person with a life that deserves to be lived on its own terms. Once, a therapist asked me what I'd learned through the worst of it. I told him that staying it felt like folding myself until the edges vanished. Leaving was unfolding. It was the slow, patient work of rebuilding the edges, of making them strong enough to carry my name. A year after I signed the final papers, I returned to Denver for a conference and walked the neighborhood that had once been mine. The house looked smaller in the light of an ordinary afternoon. He had painted over the nail marks where I'd once hung frames. Someone else's curtains fluttered in the windows where I'd watched storms. For a moment, sentimental nostalgia rushed in, a small, hungry animal, but it didn't catch me. I was no longer an ingredient in someone else's life. I was a whole recipe. I walked past the house and felt nothing but a small, steady gratitude for what had ended and a bright anticipation for what hadn't yet begun. When your life is reshaped by someone else's story, the only power you truly have is the story you tell yourself next. I stopped shrinking to fit someone else's neat narrative. I started speaking in ways that were messy and real and utterly mine. Sometimes, every so often, at 3 in the morning when the world is quiet and the city lights are a soft tide, I'll open a window and listen. The air carries the same humidity as the morning I first arrived here, and it reminds me that some changes are not losses but corrections. My life got a latitude shift, a better view, a better set of companions. The person I became in the space he tried to stuff with his needs is the person I like waking up to. And if you're listening to this, if you've ever been told to be smaller, gentler, quieter for the comfort of someone else, understand this: no one owns your orbit. You get to choose your trajectory. You get to be the one who decides whether your life is a backdrop for someone else's performance or a stage for your own. He told me I could get lost. So I did. And in the getting lost, I found where I belonged.